In the vast silence of the West, some truths are not spoken, but lived. They are carved into the heart by love and tested by the unforgiving cruelty of the land. The breath from 6-year-old Cora was a ragged, frayed thing. Her small body burned with a fire that none of Lillian's herbs or tinctures from the well-worn medicine chest could quench. For 3 days and nights she had fought for her daughter's life, and despair was a cold blade against her heart. 5 years ago, cast out by her family from the civilized East for a, quote, shameful union, Lillian had found a harsh sanctuary in the Arizona territory. Here, among the towering red rock formations and lonely saguaro cactus, she had built a new existence. She became a healer for the scattered few, the farmers and prospectors who scratched a life from the unforgiving dust. But now, her carefully gathered knowledge was useless. The fever that had seized Cora was unlike any sickness she knew. It did not come from a chill or a wound, but seemed to poison from within, draining life away one precious drop at a time. The heat radiating from the child was dry and intense, a furnace consuming her from the inside out. And Cora was not the only one. A few days prior, old Esteban, a kind Mexican farmer whose homestead was a few miles downstream, had ridden to her cabin. His face was etched with worry as he described the same affliction in his own grandchildren. They drank from the same creek, a ribbon of life that snaked through their arid world. The water had been their solace, now it seemed to be their curse. Lillian felt the walls of her solitude closing in. Her skills had always been her shield, her proof that she could survive on her own terms. Now they had failed her most important patient. The weight of her decision to remain here, so far from any real town or doctor, pressed down on her. She remembered the cold eyes of her father, as he had told her she was no longer his daughter. She had accepted that, embraced the challenge of making her own way, but she had never imagined a challenge like this, a battle for her daughter's life that she was losing. She smoothed Cora's damp hair from her forehead, her touch gentle, her heart breaking. The only thread of hope came from Esteban. He spoke of a legend, a story whispered among the old ones about the mountain tear. It was a rare, pale blue flower that grew only in the misty shadows of the waterfalls in Phantom Wind Canyon. The place was shunned by settlers, a place of spirits, they said, and sacred ground for the Yavapai warriors who guarded it. Despite the clear danger, Lillian knew she had no other choice. She entrusted Cora to the care of Esteban's wife, a woman whose hands were as kind as her husband's. With a small satchel of supplies and a heavy heart, Lillian saddled her horse and rode toward the ominous silhouette of the canyon. Phantom Wind Canyon greeted her with an unnerving silence, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind as it navigated the labyrinth of stone. The trail was narrow and treacherous, climbing steadily into the heart of the mountains. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Lillian urged her horse onward, her own fear a constant, cold companion. The stories of the canyon were enough to deter most folks. Tales of prospectors who had entered and never returned, of strange lights seen dancing on the cliffs at night. She pushed the thoughts away, focusing only on the image of Cora's feverish face. Love was a fiercer driver than fear. After hours of grueling travel, a new sound reached her ears, a low rumble that grew into the powerful roar of falling water. She dismounted and continued on foot, pushing through a curtain of thick ferns. The sight that met her stole her breath. A hidden waterfall cascaded down a sheer rock face into a crystal-clear pool below, surrounded by an oasis of impossible green. In the heart of the swirling mist, a man stood waist-deep in the icy water. He was tall and lean, a Yavapai warrior, his skin covered in ritualistic patterns of white and red clay. He was not bathing. He was performing a rite of purification, his movements slow and deliberate. Lillian froze, her body pressed against a large boulder. There was something primal and powerful in his bearing, a connection to the wild landscape that made her feel like an intruder in a sacred space. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a mix of awe and trepidation. She watched, mesmerized by the quiet dignity of the scene. As she shifted her weight, her boot dislodged a small stone. It clattered down the rocks, the sound echoing through the canyon like a gunshot. The warrior's head snapped up instantly, his entire body going rigid. He turned, water streaming from his long, dark hair, his eyes locking onto her hiding place. Their gazes met across the misty air. In his eyes, she saw no immediate threat, but a deep, profound weariness and a sharp, assessing intelligence. He stood perfectly still, a figure carved from the very rock of the canyon. Lillian felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. The moments stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He was the guardian of this place she had trespassed, a man her world would call a savage. But what she saw was a solemn gravity, a quiet strength that held no malice. The silence was broken only by the thunder of the waterfall and the frantic beating of her own heart. She knew she had to speak, to explain. But the words would not come. Finally, Lillian forced herself to step out from behind the boulder, her hands held open to show she meant no harm. Her voice, when it came, was a mere whisper, carried away by the mist. "I am sorry to disturb you. I am looking for a flower." He watched her, his expression unreadable. His gaze was intense, seeming to peer directly into her soul, weighing her purpose. She took a hesitant step closer, her worn leather boots slipping on the slick rocks. "My daughter," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength from the desperation that fueled her. "She is sick. A fever from the creek water. An old man told me of a cure, a flower that grows here." The warrior emerged from the water, moving with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and intimidating. He quickly wrapped a deerskin loincloth around his waist before speaking. His voice was low and resonant. "My people are also sick," he said in clear, accented English. "The water in the creek has turned bitter." The shared tragedy hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge between their two worlds. He told her his name was Taza. He confirmed the legend of the mountain tear, explaining it could indeed fight the sickness. "But the flower alone is not enough," he added, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "The poison in the water is strong. It requires the bitter root to neutralize it." Taza's own younger brother was afflicted with the same wasting fever. In Lillian, he saw not just another settler encroaching on his people's land, but a fellow human being caught in the same desperate struggle. He saw the same fear and love for a family member that he felt in his own heart. Their enemy was the same, an unseen poison that respected no boundaries. He made a decision. "I will show you where to find the root," he said, his voice firm. "It grows higher up, where the sun does not touch the canyon floor. We must hurry. This poison does its work quickly, and we have already lost too much time." A tentative, unspoken alliance was formed in the shadow of the sacred waterfall. He was a warrior of a people who had every reason to distrust her, and she was a woman who had been taught to fear his. Yet, a shared crisis had stripped away the layers of prejudice, revealing a common humanity. Lillian felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. She nodded, her gratitude too deep for words. "Thank you," she managed to say. Teza gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. "We are not enemies today," he said simply. "Today we are healers. Now, follow me. The path is not easy." They arrived back at Lillian's small adobe cabin as the sun bled crimson and gold across the horizon. The journey back was mostly silent, a tense, rapid trek through the deepening shadows. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sickness. At the sight of Cora, so small and still in her cot, Teza's jaw tightened. He saw in her the reflection of his own brother's suffering. Under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, they set to work. It was not merely two healers at work. It was a delicate dance between two worlds, a fusion of knowledge born from a shared desperation to save a child's life. Lillian carefully crushed the delicate blue petals of the mountain tear, her movements precise and practiced. Taza used a smooth river stone to grind the gnarled dark root he had gathered into a fine powder, chanting softly in his native tongue. The low, rhythmic sound filled the small cabin, a prayer for healing that transcended language. He explained that the chant was to honor the spirit of the plant, to ask for its full strength. Lillian listened, a sense of reverence settling over her. Her own methods, learned from books and clinical observation, suddenly felt incomplete. Together, They mixed the powders with a little clean water to form a bitter, dark concoction. Gently, they coaxed a few drops between Cora's parched lips. Then the long vigil began. Lillian bathed her daughter's forehead with cool cloths, her heart aching with every shallow breath Cora took. Taza sat quietly in a corner, a still, watchful presence. He was a sentinel in the dark, his calm focus a strange comfort in the suffocating anxiety of the night. He did not intrude, but his presence anchored her, kept the tide of her despair at bay. They were two lonely souls united by a single, desperate prayer. Just as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern peaks, a change occurred. Cora's breathing deepened, becoming less ragged. A light sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead. The violent heat that had consumed her small body began to recede. The fever had broken. Lillian felt tears of relief stream down her face as she slumped in her chair, utterly exhausted. "She will live," Taza said softly from the shadows. "But the poison remains in the earth. I must return to my people. I must find the source." Before slipping away into the pre-dawn gloom, he turned to her. "I will come back," he promised. "We will find who did this." As Cora slowly regained her strength, Lillian could not sit idle. A cold anger had replaced her despair. This was no act of nature. Someone had deliberately poisoned the creek. Following the stream upward from her cabin, she walked for miles, her eyes scanning the banks. Finally, she found it. Near an old, abandoned mineshaft, the water's surface shimmered with a faint, oily film. On the bank lay the still forms of two coyotes and a handful of small birds, their bodies stiff. This was the source. She gathered a sample of the tainted water in a glass jar, her movements grim and determined. She had her proof. With the evidence carefully packed, she rode to the nearby town of Sonora Creek. It was little more than a dusty street, lined with a saloon, a general store, and the sheriff's office. She sought out Sheriff Miller, an older man with a weary but honest face. She explained her findings, showing him the jar of oily water. Miller listened patiently, his brow furrowed with concern. But before he could offer a course of action, the door swung open, and Marshal Brody entered. Brody was a hard, imposing man who carried his authority like a weapon. He held the entire county in his grip, his power absolute and unquestioned. Brody listened to her story with a dismissive sneer. He took the jar, swirled it, and laughed without humor. "Poison?" he scoffed. "More likely some nonsense from the local heathens, trying to scare folks off their land." He looked directly at Lillian, his eyes cold and menacing. "This is cavalry business, not something for a woman to meddle in. You go on home and tend to your knitting. Leave the tracking of savages to men who understand them." His warning was clear, an order wrapped in contempt. His gaze lingered on her, promising trouble if she disobeyed. The sheriff remained silent, his authority completely eclipsed. As Lillian left the office, her heart heavy with frustration, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She glanced across the dusty street and saw him. A grim-faced man with a patch over one eye leaned against the saloon wall, pretending to clean his nails with a knife. He was Lefty Grimes, a hired gun known to do Marshal Brody's dirty work. He was not looking at her directly, but she knew. She was being watched. The message was unmistakable. She had stirred up a hornet's nest, and the hornets were now aware of her. She mounted her horse, a new kind of fear coiling in her stomach. This was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Taza kept his promise. His visits were fleeting and dangerous, always under the cloak of darkness. He would appear like a shadow at the edge of her property, a silent figure against the moonlit landscape. He brought news from his people. More were sick, though the medicine they had made was working. He also brought small offerings of dried meat or wild berries, simple gifts that spoke volumes. Lillian, in turn, told him about the abandoned mine and her encounter with the contemptuous Marshal Brody. She described Lefty Grimes, the one-eyed man who now seemed to be a permanent fixture on the horizon, a constant, silent threat. Working together, they began to piece together the puzzle. The mine belonged to Elias Croft, a wealthy and ruthless rancher whose vast property bordered the Yavapai lands. Croft had long coveted the tribe's territory, which held the only reliable water source for miles. He needed a new route to drive his cattle to the railway, a path that cut directly through the canyon the Yavapai held sacred. A conflict, one that painted the tribe as violent aggressors, would be the perfect excuse to have the cavalry drive them out. Marshal Brody, it was widely rumored, was firmly in Croft's pocket, his badge for sale to the highest bidder. Their shared purpose forged a bond between them that deepened with each secret meeting. They were two outcasts, a woman rejected by her own society and a man whose people were being systematically destroyed by hers. In the quiet of the Arizona night, they found a strange solace in each other's company. They spoke of their pasts, of the lives they had lost, and the small hopes they still harbored. Lillian found herself drawn to his quiet strength, the profound dignity that nothing seemed to shake. He, in turn, was captivated by her resilience, her fierce refusal to be broken by the world's cruelty. One night, as a cool desert breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree by her cabin, he looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "You are not like the others," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Your heart is not closed." Lillian felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "And you are not the savage they speak of," she replied softly. In that moment, the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with an unspoken emotion. It was a fragile, dangerous thing, this feeling growing between them, a single candle flame in a world of gathering darkness. The fragile peace was shattered when a group of craftsmen, posing as hunters, ambushed a small Yavapai hunting party. 2 young warriors were killed. The incident was precisely the spark Croft had been waiting for. Marshal Brody immediately declared it an unprovoked attack by savages and began recruiting a posse of concerned citizens for a punitive expedition. The town of Sonora Creek, fueled by fear and prejudice, was a tinderbox ready to ignite. The narrative was set. The Yavapai were a threat that needed to be eliminated, and Elias Croft was positioning himself as the region's savior. That evening, Esteban rode to her cabin in a panic, his horse lathered in sweat. He risked everything to bring her a warning. "Senora," he gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "Marshal Brody, he speaks your name in the saloon. He calls you a sympathizer, says you have been conspiring with the heathens." Esteban explained that Brody was building a case against her, planning to use her as proof that the Yavapai were plotting a larger war with the help of white traders. Her connection with Taza, once a source of hope, had been twisted into a weapon to be used against them both. Their love, born of desperation and a shared desire for justice, was now at the epicenter of a violent storm. That night, when Taza came, the air was heavy with impending doom. They both knew their time for secret meetings and whispered hopes was over. The forces they had challenged were now moving to crush them. He stood before her, the moonlight carving his features into a mask of grim resolve. "You and the child must leave," he said, his voice strained. "It is not safe for you here any longer." But Lillian shook her head, her own resolve hardening. "And go where?" "We are in this together, Taza. I will not run." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own fierce determination, mixed with a profound sorrow. The world would not allow them a place to stand together peacefully, so they would have to fight for it. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Under the vast, indifferent canopy of Arizona stars, they finally gave in to the powerful current that had been pulling them together from the moment their eyes first met across the misty water. Their kiss was not one of gentle romance, but one of desperate urgency, a final, defiant act of love in a world determined to tear them apart. The following day arrived with a blistering sun and the palpable stench of violence. Marshal Brody, flanked by a dozen rough-looking men from his posse, including the sneering Lefty Grimes, rode up to Lillian's cabin. They did not bother to knock. Brody kicked the door open, a rolled-up warrant in his hand. "Lillian Martin," he bellowed, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "You are under arrest for treason against the United States government and conspiracy with hostile forces." His men fanned out, their weapons drawn, their eyes hard and cruel. They had expected to find a lone, frightened woman. They were wrong. Taza had anticipated this. He was not in the cabin but positioned among the rocks of the ridge overlooking the small homestead. As Brody's men moved to grab Lillian, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the heights. One of the posse members cried out and clutched his shoulder, dropping his firearm. Chaos erupted. Brody and his men scrambled for cover, firing wildly toward the ridge. "He is here!" Brody roared. "The savage is protecting her! It is proof of her guilt!" While Taza kept them pinned down, his shots precise and deliberate, Lillian grabbed Cora and a pre-packed satchel of supplies. She ran for the back of the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs. Cora was terrified but silent, clinging tightly to her mother. A stray bullet from one of Brody's men shattered the kerosene lamp on her small kitchen table. The oil ignited instantly. Flames licked up the dry wooden walls, and in moments, the small home that had been her sanctuary became a raging inferno. The thick, black smoke provided the cover they needed. Under the protective fire from Taza's rifle and shielded by the blinding smoke, Lillian and Cora slipped away into the labyrinth of canyons behind their burning home. They watched from a safe distance as the cabin was consumed by fire, the flames devouring every trace of the life Lillian had built there. Everything was gone. They were now fugitives, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small bag of essentials. Taza met them as they navigated the rugged terrain, his face grim. "We cannot stay in this territory," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There is only one path for us now, south. We must try to reach the border of Mexico." Their home was a pillar of smoke against the blue sky, a funeral pyre for their past. Ahead lay only the harsh, unknown wilderness in a relentless pursuit. The chase was merciless. Lefty Grimes, it turned out, was more than just a gunman. He was a relentless tracker who read the desert terrain like an open book. He led Marshal Brody's posse on their trail, never far behind. Taza used all his knowledge of the land to throw them off. He led them across stretches of flat, sun-baked rock that held no prints, and through dense thickets of mesquite and chala that tore at their clothes and slowed the horses of their pursuers. Lillian proved her own worth, her knowledge of plants allowing them to find edible roots and sources of water where none seemed to exist. They traveled by night and hid during the brutal heat of the day, the landscape itself an enemy. Cora was resilient, her childish fear tempered by an unshakable faith in her mother and Taza. To her, it was a terrifying adventure, and she rarely complained. Lillian and Taza's bond was forged anew in the crucible of their flight. They moved as one, communicating with glances and gestures, their lives depending on a perfect, unspoken trust. The quiet moments, huddled together in the pre-dawn chill, were filled with a tense intimacy, their love a small, warm shelter against the vast, hostile wilderness. In a narrow, winding canyon, Taza decided they had to make a stand to buy more time. He sent Lillian and Cora ahead, telling them to hide and wait for a signal. He then chose a strategic position and waited. When the posse entered the canyon, he opened fire, his shots echoing from the stone walls, creating the illusion of multiple gunmen. The ambush threw Brody's men into confusion. But Lefty Grimes was cunning. He dismounted and scaled the canyon wall, circling around to flank Taza's position. The ensuing fight was short and brutal. Taza was wounded, a bullet grazing his shoulder, but his own shot was true. Lefty Grimes fell from the ridge and did not get up again. Having lost his best tracker and with several men wounded, Marshal Brody was forced to make a temporary retreat to regroup. The hard-won respite gave the fugitives precious time. Taza, though in pain from his injury, dismissed it as a minor inconvenience. They pressed on, pushing their bodies to the limit. They knew Brody's retreat was not a surrender. It was merely a pause. The marshal was now driven by more than just Croft's orders. He was driven by a personal vendetta. He would not stop until he saw them captured or dead. The border was still days away, and their temporary advantage felt as fragile as a desert mirage. They knew the brief reprieve would not last. Brody's rage, Taza explained, would make him reckless but also more determined. He led them toward an old, abandoned silver mine near the border. a place of shadows and forgotten tunnels where they might find temporary refuge. But as they approached the dilapidated structures, Taza sensed something was wrong. The silence was too perfect, the air too still. It was an ambush. Not only was Brody there, but Elias Croft himself had come, determined to oversee the final, bloody act of his scheme. They had been herded into a trap. The final confrontation was at hand. The air exploded with gunfire. Bullets splintered the weathered wood of the old mine buildings. Taza pushed Lillian and Cora into the relative safety of a collapsed mine shaft as he returned fire. They were outnumbered and outgunned. As the gunfight raged, Lillian saw her chance. A short distance away, next to the assay office, sat a crate stenciled with the word danger. It was old dynamite, left behind by the miners, likely unstable and volatile. While Taza drew their fire, she crept from their hiding place, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to create a diversion, their only hope. She reached the crate, her hands trembling as she lit a piece of frayed rope she had found. She tossed it toward the crate and scrambled back to safety, just as a massive explosion ripped through the mine yard. The blast sent wood and debris flying, sowing chaos and panic among Croft's men. In the confusion, Taza, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, took careful aim. A single shot rang out, and Elias Croft fell to the dust, his greedy ambitions ending in an instant. Marshal Brody, seeing his benefactor fall, let out a roar of pure fury. He ignored his own men and charged directly at Lillian, his face a mask of hate. Seeing the immediate danger to Cora, Lillian raised the small firearm Taza had insisted she carry. She had never fired it at a person before. As Brody lunged toward them, she closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. When the dust settled and the ringing in her ears subsided, a profound silence fell over the old mine. They were wounded, exhausted, and covered in grime, but they were alive. Together, the three of them walked toward the shallow river that marked the border. They crossed the water hand in hand, leaving the land of blood and lies behind them. Ahead lay a new country and an unknown future, one they had earned together, a testament to a love that no border could ever contain.